Hi, this is Annette Ross, host of Common Ground on the Sylvia Global Media Network. Today I have with me Luisa Cabal, who is the Vice President of Programs at the Center for Reproductive Rights. Luisa, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
I just wanted to begin a little bit with your background and how you got into being so passionate about the issue of reproductive rights for women.
Well, I grew up in Colombia, in Latin America, and when I graduated from law school and started working, I started traveling all over Colombia and, realized and saw different ways in which discrimination against women played out, in particular in rural areas.
Mhm.
And I decided that I wanted to work on gender and policy and the law. And that's why I decided to pursue my graduate education here in New York, and was lucky enough that I found a job here at the Center for Reproductive Rights, where I've been now for almost 16 years and started working precisely on issues around women's rights.
What do they do there at the center? They help shape
Our
policy?
Yeah, our mission at the center is to use legal and human rights strategies to make sure that governments around the world, not just here in the US, but around the world, protect reproductive rights as fundamental rights.
And this is my big question, what are reproductive rights? What does that mean?
Reproductive rights basically means, if one could define it in a simple way, it means two basic things. One is the ability to make decisions about one's reproductive life. Uh, and the second component of reproductive rights is that it's not just enough to be able to make those decisions, but actually have access to the services through which you can exercise those rights. So to give you an example, um, it is not enough if you think about reproductive rights to say, well, the government is not intruding or in my choices. I think that's a first step. That is fantastic if governments are not placing obstacles on women, for example, deciding to access contraceptives. But the second piece, which is as important, is that and that's where the human rights framework holds promise, is that it tells governments that it's not enough to just protect those choices, that those choices are meaningless if you don't ensure or provide ways for women, in this case, to access, right, the services and afford the second component of reproductive rights.
How is that playing out here? I mean, we'll go into the international arena, which I know is quite different, but would you say that in most states there is that kind of access right now?
I think, unfortunately,
Because the law's on our side. I mean, the
the
law is on the side of reproductive rights, it seems to me, right? Or
well, we're still holding on to the promise of Roe v. Wade, right? That promise that uh, basically access to, abortion is a constitutional right. The problem is that this right has been eroded in the past 4 decades. So what you see right now is that the exercise of reproductive rights depends on where you live. And that's the unfortunate situation. It is a constitutional right, but it is different for a woman in New York or in California, the possibility of exercising those rights, as it is in Mississippi, for example, where the last clinic is trying to stay open and is under attack right now. So it is, we used to say that, yeah, the law is supposed to be on our side, but we're not sure that is no longer true, just because there are states where we are constantly under attack and where the providers basically are stopping to provide services.
So these services don't happen usually in a hospital setting, would you say, Luisa? Right now, I'm still talking United States because I'm trying to understand. I thought you could terminate a pregnancy and you didn't necessarily have to go to a clinic like you were describing. You could actually have it happen, in a hospital setting. Is that accurate?
The truth is that, abortion is one of the safest medical procedures.
Yes, I know.
So you could have it as around the world it happens in any setting. You don't need a hospital facility. Don't need a surgical facility. Basically, you could even have it as it happens again around the world. You can have it in a doctor's office.
Okay.
Not even you need to be an OBGYN. Around the world there are midwives, there are nurse practitioners that practice, early abortions.
And that's safe?
And they're safe.
Okay.
Actually, in California, there have been recent reforms to ensure that what we call mid-level providers, such as nurse practitioners, can, perform the abortions. The challenge has been that unfortunately, the anti-choice movement is trying to the way in which they're trying to place restrictions on abortion is by saying, well, you can only perform an abortion, right, if you have an ambulatory surgical facility. And so what they're trying to regulate in the state is how it's basically architectural, right? What are the requirements, right? So that doctors would have to invest, thousands or millions of dollars, right, to be able to perform the abortions. And many just say, I cannot continue to have this practice. So even though it's one of the safest, it doesn't require all this regulations. It is safe without all of these regulations. That is one of the tactics to basically stop the providers who care about women to stop them from continuing to perform the services.
And what do you think about the pro-life movement, the other side of the argument?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear your question.
What do you think about the pro-life movement? I mean, the other side of the argument, what do you think about not their tactics, but what do you just think about the argument in general? You think that going back, if they were to get any sort of momentum and overturn Roe versus Wade, you think that we're going backward?
Oh, absolutely. I came from a country where, when I was growing up, abortion was illegal under all circumstances. The doctors I would interview would tell me of young girls basically hemorrhaging to death. They had seen the consequences of bans on abortion, and it seems like we forgot about what it looks like to impose bans and further restrict. And the data is telling us that this is not just a human rights issue, but actually criminal laws don't work. Women even will always have abortions, regardless, right, of whether you criminalize it or not. What you can have in place is sexuality education programs. You can have access to contraception to ensure that women can effectively exercise those rights. And in fact, in countries like Holland in Europe, they have the lowest abortion rates in the world, but it's not because they're banning abortion. In fact, they have one of the most liberal laws in abortion, but they also provide broad access to sexuality education, access to contraceptive methods. And so, in fact, women can exercise their reproductive rights in a way the incidence of abortion is quite low.
See, I think that's really important. See, I think the two sides are too against each other, and that is not working effectively even for them to get their agenda going. If their agenda really is to have abortions be lower, you know what I mean, or have less of them, there are ways to do that. And I see exactly what you're saying. So were you saying that in South America, the girls were hemorrhaging because they were trying to to have their own abortions. They were trying to
But
do it themselves.
of course, if you cannot, if it's illegal, then what you have is women self-inducing abortions with whatever plants, medications, inserting catheters, inserting whatever they find. And this is the reality of what we see in Central America where there are still absolute bans, what we see in the Philippines, or where we see what we see in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. That is still the reality. And to those who say, we're trying to restrict abortions to lower abortion rates, as I said, that is not the case. The evidence is not there. But unfortunately, those who oppose access to abortion, they're also opposing access to contraception, right? That's the same kind of discourse, because what is underlying all of this is a vision of women. What is at stake here is women's place in society, right? What they're denying is
Like what their role is, like what their fundamental role is in a society, which would be then to only procreate, right?
exactly, a woman is in the house, just and her role is to just raise a family and be with her family and make no reproductive decision making. Um, and so that's why you see, efforts to ban, right, insurance coverage of abortion. That's at the center of a current litigation in the Supreme Court in this country, right? Whether basically your employer can decide whether or not they cover contraception or not. Yes, it's a lifestyle drug. That's what it's at stake of, that it will give to its women.
So your feeling is that, so if you're using Holland as an example, it doesn't play out that if they have access, if they have more education and they have access to contraceptives, it's not like all of a sudden you have all these girls running wild in this promiscuity and a total breakdown of a family unit. That would not be an accurate depiction. I mean, that's probably their worst fears, right? I mean, their fears are a total breakdown of some sort of structured family life. I'm trying to understand the other side of their fears and to address them.
Yes, I think, as I said, at the core of it is a breakdown of uh, their notion of what a woman is supposed to be. So I don't think that they care. That's why they don't care about the evidence. If the evidence tells them that sexuality education works, right, that comprehensive evidence-based sexuality education works, that access to contraception actually decreases abortions, they don't care about that evidence. Because or else they would be actually trying to ensure broad access to contraception, sexuality education. What they want is their vision of how a family should be, right? Which is heterosexual. It is, no access to contraception, so that a woman's role is just to stay at home. And we're actually working with some researchers, and some of their very, very initial data. What they're showing is that actually many of the states who proclaim themselves to be protecting the potential of life, the fetal life, actually once the children are born, don't have social policies in place to actually protect women, pregnant women, and children. So it's research that is going to be coming up, but I just think that when you still start scratching through the surface, you'll start finding that again, it's not even the concern for healthy families, because then they don't want to make the investments or the policy decisions that would in fact protect pregnancy and childbearing and all of the systems and the networks that families actually need, right, for their families to thrive.
Yes, for their families to thrive. So weren't you part of something in Brazil for maternal, I think I wrote it down, a government decision to guarantee women maternal health?
Y- Yes, absolutely.
What was the case about?
Yeah, and I'll tell you about the case, but this is also when we were talking about reproductive rights, right? It's about making choices, right? If you are pregnant and want to have that baby,
Hmm.
right, you should have access to the services you need to have a healthy pregnancy, right?
Yes.
Your prenatal checkups
Your
and the
ultrasounds, right?
exactly, and have the ability to deliver that baby and not risk dying and deliver that baby with dignity. So we are also, like any other reproductive health organization should be, for healthy pregnancies, right? If the women are deciding to have those babies, there should be the conditions. And what is interesting is that like around 15 years ago, there were more than 500,000 women dying every year around the world for causes related to their pregnancies. And
Hmm.
not a lot of investments were being made, right, to ensure that women were not dying in childbirth.
Hmm.
What we felt is that had been a lot of talk, right? But nothing was changing this statistic. Decided what to do with this case was, it's not a particular case because it's the case that happens to, again, the rates of maternal mortality have gone down, but unfortunately still around 300,000 of these maternal deaths continue to happen every year. But what we tried to do was litigate this case. It was the first case litigated in one of these UN bodies, trying to say governments, and it's not just the poor governments, right? Even governments in middle-income countries like Brazil, um, are not doing enough to prevent, maternal mortality, are not investing enough in their women. And so we brought this case about this young Afro-Brazilian woman. She was 28 years old. She already had a child, a 5-year-old girl. She wanted to have this baby, and she would go to her prenatal checkups. But what happened was the reflection of a broken system, where she started, feeling that something was not right. She goes to her health post. She's very poor, but there's a health post in her neighborhood. They send her back home with vitamins and aspirin. Well, a few days later, she's still not feeling well. She goes back, and of course, there was no fetal heartbeat. The fetus had died, and they just wait a long time to evacuate the fetus. She starts hemorrhaging. Uh, they start knowing that they need to take her to another facility, but nobody calls or calls another institution so that they can have an ambulance. In the end, the family of this woman has to find a private ambulance when it's already a little bit late. She's entering into a coma to go to a better hospital. When she arrives in another hospital, her medical files are not with her, and she dies in a corridor in a hospital. So
No.
and again, this is not just, you might say this is about malpractice. Well, it could be a little bit of malpractice, but what we were trying to showcase with this case, because is that there are thousands of cases like this, where the government is not putting enough attention of how this deaths, like Aline, her name was Aline, um, that her death could have been prevented with very simple measures, with very, cost not expensive measures. And the government actually has recognized international responsibility, and has paid reparations to her family. And this case is being used around the world as other groups and women and activists are trying to hold their governments accountable for not doing enough to prevent maternal mortality.
What do you think they should have done? They probably should have evacuated the pregnancy right then, right? When they knew the
Yeah,
fetus had died?
yeah, I think that there were a couple of delays. What is interesting is that there's a lot of writing in the public health literature of what are the major breakdowns in the systems that, if you address them, could prevent many of these deaths. And it's
Mhm.
called the model of the the three delays, right? The
Mhm.
first delay is a delay in seeking care. Clearly, this woman did not have that delay. She knew that
What?
something was wrong and she goes there. But then there was a delay in giving her the medical attention she needed, right? Evacuating that. Well, there was clearly malpractice in not doing something when more, right? To where if she had had an earlier diagnostic, right? Maybe something else could have been done. But you're right, the evacuating, right? The dead fetus, and then just seeing her deteriorate, right? And then it's the delay of taking her to another facility once there's an obstetric complication, right? If she's hemorrhaging, then there's another delay, right? So these are things that you might, with protocols and with correct training, you address these delays and save a lot of women, right? And it sounds like, oh, but it seems so simple, right?
Mhm.
But the lack of training, right, the lack of accountability in the health systems in many countries is what accounts for thousands of women dying. And I was reading actually yesterday. I didn't have a chance to read the full article, but it seems like there's data in the U.S. of how actually maternal mortality rates have increased in the U.S.
Why, you think?
Uh, uh, well, it's because, again, I think we've all heard about inequalities,
You
right?
mean
And
in the lower income? Was it were the deaths mostly occurring in the lower income?
I just read a short article on it, so I haven't read the study to see
Mhm.
what were their findings, right? Where are they related? Is it related to income? But what we know, and actually what the data does tell us, is that it's the most vulnerable and marginalized groups, the ones who are most impacted, whether it's by HIV, right, and by maternal health, bad maternal health outcomes. So even though I haven't looked at which are the states, right, and which are the conditions, we do know that, of course, it's the low-income women from ethnic minorities, generally Latino or African Americans, the ones that are most impacted by, negative health outcomes such as maternal mortality. But what would be interesting for us to look into is which are the states? What is this new data revealing when the U.S. used to be, out of, in this, statistically, one of the 20th country in terms of maternal health outcomes, and it rolled out to literally around, I forget if it was 50 something, or so it's not doing well even on maternal health.
Where are they doing well? I'm sort of curious. What sort of countries are more the socialist countries?
Um, well, the ones that have the lowest maternal mortality rates,
Yes.
I was reading in that article yesterday that, well, Canada has a very low rate of maternal mortality. Saudi Arabia has a very low maternal mortality rate, and all of the Western European countries, the UK and all the continental European countries and the Nordic countries have very low maternal mortality rates. So I do think it's helpful to ask ourselves, right? What is happening here, right? Why? Um, why do we seem to have gone back and not moved forward in terms of improving access to maternal health services?
That is interesting. Or it's interesting to look at maybe what they're doing right. What are they offering that maybe we're not offering? Something in terms of just the access that they have to healthcare and the socialized medicine. I don't know. I know Canada has that system, and I believe that the Nordic
Yeah,
countries do as well. Like,
yeah, because they have access to health insurance, right? It's basically it's a government insurance program, and the question here is, well, as we know, there are millions of uninsured. Um, and of course, if women
yes.
are not insured, they won't go to their prenatal checkups, right? The interesting thing could be is going to be to look at what is the impact, right, of the Affordable Care Act in future years on these maternal health outcomes.
Yeah, that will take a while. Now,
Yeah.
did you feel, is that something that the Center for Reproductive Rights was involved in shaping the policy for the Affordable Care Act? Was there any, were there advisors?
Well, we provided, we were part of the civil society, the groups from civil society trying to push for, coverage of reproductive rights issues. And we continue to defend, as I say, there's a case pending in the Supreme Court called Hobby Lobby, which could be decided later this year, in which the Supreme Court will decide whether, again, your private employer, any company, can decide whether or not they cover contraception if it's against their beliefs. So basically, thousands of women working with big companies may be subjected, depending on how the decision goes, to whatever the beliefs of a private company's owner is.
Okay, but there's a separation of church and state. I mean, and I say that as a Catholic. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, what doesn't make sense about contraceptives, especially if you think it would be the thing that maybe would avoid the greater, if you want to call it the greater, the greater evil? Not that it's evil. I'm not saying a termination of pregnancy is evil. It is all at all. But from their perspective, that's what they're trying to avoid. So why wouldn't that be a logical and a choice that everybody would embrace?
I think we ask ourselves the same question.
Now,
Why is it that they're trying to deny women access, to contraception? It seems like, I think Rush Limbaugh, in her attack of Sandra Fluke, was very clear, and I guess it really was clear what is behind this, right? When he called this student that was wanted to testify before Congress on why women should have access to contraception, and she was called a slut, right? So this is what it's at the heart of this, right? That the women that have access and that can decide and put their sexual lives and their reproduction and their choices around reproduction as in their hands, then they're the easy women and they're sluts, as Rush Limbaugh called them.
what do you see happening in other countries? It must be frightening, the things that you see, and the young girls, because I know you do a lot with human rights as well, right? Some of what I've read about you went into genital mutilation. Am I correct? Did I get that right?
Yeah, we view reproductive rights within a broad umbrella of rights. So anything that is impacting, right, a girl's or a young woman's decision to make these decisions, we try to work on those issues. So of course, mutilating the bodies of young girls through the practice known as female genital mutilation. We've written reports about that and denounced this practice before the United Nations and other bodies.
And that is still happening, Luisa. That is still happening.
That is still happening, unfortunately. Yeah.
Okay.
Millions of women. Yeah, millions of women. There are countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in countries like Egypt as well, the Middle East, and there are countries that are making progress. Even within sub-Saharan Africa, there are countries where through laws and through a lot of work with community leaders to change, the rites of passage, a lot of change has been done, but a lot still needs to be done. And also there are new campaigns, not just around this issue, but also around child marriage, right? Young girls being married, being given in marriage as young as 9 years old, right? Having babies at 11, 12, and many dying in childbirth because, of course, they're their bodies,
Are
right?
not ready for that.
Um, it is. So a lot of our campaigns are also around ensuring that the practice of child marriage is as well abandoned and condemned.
So what do you guys actually do when you say you have campaigns, let's say around child marriage? You're sending people out there on the forefront and they're talking with leaders in those areas?
Yeah. Yeah, what we find is we're a human rights organization, so we need to first collect the evidence, right? From a human rights perspective means it
Right.
means interviewing the women, trying to interview the key stakeholders, the key people in the countries. Um, and so if we're doing work around child marriage, for example, it's around going to the country, talking to people about the impacts, right, of these practices. So we produce reports, sometimes videos, and we take them to those who can make decisions about, this problem. So we do a lot of public visibility, campaigns or panels in the countries, but also we go to the UN or we go and lobby the US government so that the UN and the US government and other actors at the international level can put pressure on these governments to change their laws and change these practices. So a lot of it is we have to gather the evidence and then do a lot of lobbying and advocacy. And in many cases, when that is not enough, a lot of our work has been to bring cases, right? We bring cases, we help the groups on the ground bring cases at the national level, but we also help the groups bring cases to the international courts when their national level courts don't respond.
Okay, so what would you say, for example, what's happening now in Nigeria? It's Nigeria, right? The girls who were taken? I'm sorry.
Our most pioneering
Okay.
Hi, I'm
Hey,
sorry.
hey.
Yeah, I completely lost. Yeah,
I
go
lost you too, but I lost you on. I was asking you about the women, the girls who were just kidnapped and they're being maybe sold into slavery in Nigeria. I don't know what you're saying. I missed what you were saying, but I'll be able to connect the two pieces. Um, were you
yeah.
answering that question?
Well, the truth is, although, of course, it's one of the most egregious violations that can happen.
Hmm.
We don't work directly on sex trafficking or slavery, but clearly this is, one of the most egregious violations on human rights. Basically, kidnapping these girls and probably to sell them into marriage. It's the clearest example of absolute fundamentalism, right? In terms
Hmm.
of and I just think that this is a real moment for the global community to get together, right, and support the Nigerian government in finding these girls, right? In sending also a strong message that no one should get away with this, right?
Right. Well, my thought was, did you guys get involved because maybe they are going to be sold into marriage? I mean, there's probably no way to even to know that that's what's happening with them.
Uh, to be honest with you, we haven't gotten involved, but I don't think this is even a case of child marriage. This is just a clear-cut case of basically sexual slavery. Not even, yeah.
That's so. So where do you sort of, like you said, you sort of have a big umbrella? Is there a place where you sort of draw the line and you're more hands off? This would be an area that the Center for Reproductive Rights, even internationally, doesn't necessarily. That's not really under your area.
Yeah. Yeah, even though we have a broad umbrella under reproductive rights, you also, when you work in an organization that has, limited resources and a very
Mhm.
specific mission, you want to have an impact, right? So
Right.
you have to also strike this balance between remaining really focused on what you're trying to achieve while trying to be supportive of other organizations and their work. So for
Mm.
example, there are organizations working on sex trafficking, right? And that's what they focus on, and they are experts on the issue, and they do it really well. There are organizations that work on domestic violence, right? We don't work on domestic violence, but we do try to find the intersection, right, of reproductive rights and broader issues. So to give you an example, even though we don't work of girls, right, which is a very important issue in the development and the girls' rights agenda, we have documented how women in countries like Tanzania in Africa, but also in other countries in Africa, do forced pregnancy testing on girls when they're in school against their consent. And if a girl is found to be pregnant, they're expelled from school. Of course, many of them just drop out. They are not reintegrated back into school. So you find a circle, right, of sort of abandonment for these women, because these girls are not being, they don't get sexuality education, right? If they're forced to have forced pregnancy testing, if they're pregnant, then they're expelled from school, and then they don't have any access to education. So we work at the intersection, right, where there are reproductive rights, but when other rights like the right to education is impacted. We have also worked on issues on violence, against women, for example, in hospitals, where health personnel has mistreated women or sterilized them without their consent. That's another issue we've worked on, like forced sterilization or coercive sterilization of women.
Wait,
So
what situation? Where would that happen? That someone would be forced to be sterilized? I've never even heard of that.
um, yes, it still happens. I worked a lot in the 90s in Peru when there were campaigns to sterilize indigenous and poor women living in rural areas, and we documented and we brought cases
Okay.
denouncing coercive practices. In Europe, it has been documented against coercive sterilization of Roma women. These are the gypsy women living in many of the Eastern European countries. So unfortunately, we thought, one would think that this was a thing of the past, right? Women sterilized without their consent. And we've also heard it around women living with HIV who have delivered a baby and then found out, months later that they were sterilized and nobody asked for their consent. So it is still unfortunately out there that others want to decide which women and how many children they should be having.
So, Luisa, I find this is really interesting because I find that you guys are almost a misunderstood organization. That would be something that you would think anyone who was even on the pro-life side, right, would get behind because you don't believe in someone forcing you to not have babies or to have babies, either way, basically, right?
Ex- Absolutely, absolutely. I think it has been a tactic of many, conservative groups or anti-choice groups to just label women's rights groups for one of the areas in which we work, because of course it's not convenient for them to to acknowledge, right, that at the core of our work is women's dignity, right? It's their ability to make those choices and also to defend them, to ensure that a government or no one should be sterilizing them, right, without their consent. Or but equally important, also not forcing them to have a child, right?
Yeah, you know what I want to ask you, because I mean, I can't, there's no way to get around this. I mean, just philosophically speaking, when you talk about the rights of our bodies and our fertility, um, as a woman, I always question this in myself, like, do I do I own my body or do I have some obligation, to God in that? I mean, I know this is where the dialogue has gotten really confusing. As a person who, believes in God, and there is a separation of church and state, I get that. But as a person who believes in God, and that would be someone like me, I think about that all the time. I think I have a certain responsibility to honor my body, to take care of it, and to not necessarily to procreate, but I do think that they're getting something confused in the philosophy of honoring God in some way in terms of not. I think the idea of we own our bodies is a tough concept because really our isn't our whole of life sort of a gift? Is that where they're getting confused? I guess I would ask you that. I look at my life like it's a gift, and I don't take full ownership of it, except I want to be a good steward of it while I'm here. I feel a responsibility to be a good steward of my life. So I take all those decisions that we're discussing very seriously. I wonder if I might not be expressing myself well, but I think it's so important to get the dialogue in this progressing into a better place and to really understand where it is the pro-life people are stuck.
Yeah, and I hear you, and I I just think that what we should be looking into is what are our shared values, right? Because there
Okay,
are values which are shared, right? Of dignity, right? One would hope, right?
that's what I agree with.
A person's dignity. I think they might question it, but one's physical integrity, right? One's health. Uh, but the question begins when, or the problem begins when I feel that I have to impose, right, my values on you, right, or my version of what it means, where the limit of your own rights stop, right? So unfortunately, it has always been for women the ones who have had to suffer and basically curtail their rights or being denied their rights because I'm sorry, is that I lost you for
Yeah, for 1 second, but you said the women being denied their rights.
uh, it's always imposing, right, on women a particular view of life or of rights. And we forget about those shared values. So I do think that we need to reopen conversations and restart conversations, but where the starting point is what are our shared values, and
Yes.
let's acknowledge the dignity of women, right?
No, I think that's a really excellent point. If the conversation began with what does it mean for a woman to have her dignity and what does it mean for a woman to have ownership of her body, I do think that that phrase in itself gets taken out of context
Yeah.
quite a bit. And then it comes down harshly when you think of, you know, uh, a termination of a pregnancy. Now, because, you know, I've had conversations with my doctors. Actually, I think it's okay to interject a little personal story because last year at 45, I'm 45, I got pregnant with, and I was very surprised. And I already have 4 girls. I mean, I was like, I don't want a baby.
Wow. Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, I have 4 girls, and so I was pregnant, and I went, and I was concerned for a lot of reasons, being older. And I went and saw my doctor, and I discussed, what would that, what if I just don't think I can do this, And I said to the doctor, and she was great. I mean, because she could terminate a pregnancy. That's something we discussed. And it was very hard for me to discuss it, a lot of tears. And she said, I said, do you think this is life? And she said something really interesting. And obviously, she terminates pregnancies. It was part of what her job is. And she said, you know, I think it's a stage of life. Like there are stages of life. It is a stage of development in life. Yes, I do think that. And then we went and furthered the conversation. But is there a point when that stage of life is developed enough that it does get protected inside the womb, or is there not that point when it comes to reproduction? When do the rights of that developing fetus become there are rights there as well? I don't even know where the line is anymore, or if there is one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you
Yeah.
hear
In
me?
the United States, the line, sorry, I think I was losing you, but you were asking about what is that line, and the interesting thing is that courts around the world and governments around the world have acknowledged, you know, for centuries even, that rights are not absolute, right?
Mm-hmm.
That, of course, right, women's autonomy in decision making or your right to privacy, it's not absolute, right? So what does this mean in the context of reproductive decision making? You know, it's not just the US, but many courts around the world have said, well, you can make a decision, right, to terminate a pregnancy up to a certain limit in the after which, right, the government has an interest, just because of the different stages of life, has an more of an interest in protecting that potential life, right? And many of the countries, what they recognize is exceptions. For example, second or third trimester abortions usually are permitted to save the woman's life or when her health is also in danger, right? So even in the US, it's not like the right of the woman is absolute, right? Here, generally speaking, the point where the government really intervenes is viability, right? And where there are restrictions post viability, and what is interesting is that only a small percentage of the abortions in this country actually occur post viability, and only happen, right, when a woman's health or life is in danger. But clearly, you're absolutely right. The governments and the courts realize this, right? That they acknowledge that recognition and that interest in potential life varies through pregnancy and should not be the same. The challenge is that the opposition doesn't acknowledge this. We've all heard the politicians, right, that have said, well, we are against abortion even in cases of rape, right? We've heard them. And when not even contraception, right, is part of an agenda of access, then it's the whole understanding of women's rights, what it's at stake.
No, it is. And I don't think it had I not had a personal experience and those sorts of conversations with doctors in my journey, I would have understood it from that perspective. And I can't imagine, I couldn't envision that I would have been forced one way or another to do anything. And that's why I really wanted to have you on. I'm actually having someone else on the show again to talk about the same issue, because after having gone through that experience, which really profoundly changed me, I thought, are some people actually forced? I mean, forced into one way or the other way, which seemed really went against my, I couldn't imagine, I mean, I did go on to have the baby, and she was fine. That didn't have to be, now I have 5 girls.
Oh, that's so nice.
Oh, who's going to raise them? I don't know. But I talk to the girls, especially my older daughters, a lot about this kind of stuff, because I want them to take the potential of life very seriously. I don't want them to be careless, because that is a beautiful gift of that women offer this world, right? I mean, that's where another place where the language between the two sides gets really it's not what it needs to be. I'm talking to you, and you're talking about women's dignity. You obviously care about women, and you obviously care about girls and about protecting them and not being put into marriage when they're 9 and 11 and having them in danger. And as you said, you have to care for the life, not just as it's a fetus. And Thomas
Hmm.
Friedman wrote this once, actually.
Hmm.
What about the life after the womb?
Yeah.
I mean, that
Yeah.
has to be cared about every bit as much as the life inside the womb, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
So a lot of this gets lost in the discussion, but I just can't imagine the issue or the choice being forced upon me one way or the other. I had to have support, and as many women do, and they don't get, and they go through the process and feel that safely and intelligently, I could make a decision that I could handle emotionally and everything else that comes with that, which is
Yeah.
part of what I think education part of
Yeah.
what you guys are trying to do there.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I see it as that you guys actually care for women, and I don't see it as you're against life by being pro-choice.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, but I understand the idea, and I guess you do too, because you've got two kids as well, that you cherish what only women can do, which is bring another human being into being.
Absolutely. And what you want is those choices to be responsible, but you also want for women to bring wanted childs into the world, that those choices are made, right, by people and by couples or individuals thinking about what it means and not being imposed on them, as you said, right? That it's a choice and not an imposition.
It was frightening to think that that could be imposed on anyone. And it's even more frightening to me that the idea of contraceptives, and I just wanted to ask you, I know we're sort of finishing up here, but I wanted to ask you about that, and I meant to ask you earlier about contraceptives. In other parts of the world, like Africa, do they accept contraceptives more readily, more easily?
There are still challenges, and the challenges in some instances can be cultural, right? In terms of uh, the expectation of women having multiple kids and what that means within a community, right? There are also misconceptions about the side effects, right, or what contraception can do to your body. And then even when women, there's a big unmet need, even when women would like to space their children, right, or have less children, there's literally lack of access in many countries. So women are not having the means to access them because they're not being made readily available. So there are big new initiatives, in fact, promoted by the Gates Foundation, for example,
Oh,
uh, to get more access to contraceptives, in particular where they're needed the most. So that is encouraging.
and so, you know, do you like your work, Luisa? Is it totally frustrating? I just,
I love my work. You have to be an eternal optimist, right? To believe that things can change because sometimes uh, it can be frustrating and outrage. To give you an example, when we heard about a case in Brazil of a young girl, and this is not something that never happens. I think that every few months we hear about these cases of 9-year-old raped by a family member, pregnant, a girl pregnant at 9 or 10 or 11. And then when we hear whether it's government officials or the bishop just saying that they would excommunicate the mother and the child if they terminate a pregnancy that is a result of rape, then it's when you really get discouraged, right? Like you try as to think what is going, right? What's happening there, right? Why can't these individuals put themselves in these girls or in this mother's shoes, right? What is wrong there? that can be discouraging. But when you see laws changing, right? When you see the women's rights activists, fighting for, with very little resources, fighting for these girls and these women's rights, going to the UN so that things change at the global level as well, that's where I draw my inspiration from, and what keeps us all going.
So
And
that's,
also,
yeah.
and also thinking of my girls, right? When you also have girls, I feel it as a responsibility, right? What is the world in which I want my daughters to grow in, right? I want a world of equality, and so I guess, yeah, it's for them as well.
So you do feel that's what gives you optimism when you see people fighting so hard, even though the cases that you hear about sometimes, you must just say to yourself, this seems like an insurmountable, to, to change the way people think or the collective consciousness, I think, is a very slow process. So your work, I think, requires probably a tremendous amount of patience. And, it's funny because when you bring, again, we don't even have to bring in the church or God into any of this because I think there should be this separation. But because that is a big part of the issue and because many people still believe in something like that, and I say I'm one of them, I'll never forget what my priest said to me. I must have a very liberal priest. He said, God loves you no matter what. And I feel like if more people, who were helping those who, like the situation you just described with that young girl, instead of saying you're excommunicated,
Yeah.
saying that you are loved. That's about the dignity of the person. You are loved. Yeah. That's an empowering phrase.
That's what we yeah, I wish all of the faith leaders and priests would be like this, right? Empowering people and respecting the conscience of people, right? And and yeah, sending a message of love, right? I, I think, I hope, right? My hope is that also within the different churches, there's more openness, right, to future respect of women's rights. Yeah.
Well, thank you for being here today. Thank you for the work you're doing on behalf of women and for being so open to talking to me about, where they can find, both sides can find a common place to hopefully progress and actually respect the dignity of women, because I think that's what you're striving for and that's what I'm striving for by having common ground. I mean, it means a great deal to me that you came on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.